Welcome to Sometimes Love Isn't Enough, the Parenting Through Challenges podcast. I am your host, Angie Grandt, and today I want to talk about this concept of terrible twos. And I was thinking as I pressed record that perhaps I've talked about this before, but I wanted to bring up this topic again for a couple of reasons. One, I think that as humans, oftentimes we need to hear things multiple times before it really sinks in, before we break old patterns of thinking. And oftentimes we need to hear things multiple times, or even for myself, I need to hear it and then I need to talk it out sometimes here with you, sometimes with people in my everyday life, sometimes conversations with myself. But sometimes some of us need to talk things out in order to come to a deeper level of understanding when we're learning a new concept. And so, for as long as I can remember, I mean, probably back since I was a young child, there has been this concept of the terrible twos. And this, at least in the Midwest where I live and was raised, this concept that toddlers will act like awful humans, and as adults, we either tolerate it or punish it, or some laugh at it, but that this idea that it's just a normal part of the 2-year-old phase and that it's something that's out of our control. And so I want to dispel some myths around this concept of the terrible twos today in this episode. So, in this episode, I want to dig into maybe some myths about the terrible twos and to challenge you to consider different ways of thinking about toddlers. And here's why. Because when we go at our, parenting or grandparenting, or if you're a clinician working with kids or a neighbor who has, toddlers, or whatever your role is in a toddler's life, if we go into that relationship assuming that they're going to misbehave, assuming that that it's just a rite of passage for 2-year-olds, and assuming that there's nothing that we can do to um and I'm not thinking about like alleviating their distress, although hopefully that's an outcome of it. Because the purpose of this episode is not to say like let's do everything in our power to stop the toddlers from crying. Not at all. But when we can shift our lens and take a deeper look what's underneath those behaviors, perhaps we'll take a different approach. And my hope is through this episode that as we explore different approaches, we consider what the positive and maybe negative outcomes might be when we shift our approach with our kids. So, the first thing that I want to explore is what oftentimes leads to the behaviors in the first place. Oftentimes, I'll hear parents say that their child is tantruming because they didn't get their way. And while there's definitely some truth to that, right? When we take a deeper look at what's underneath that and why this is now something that's happening when children reach around the age of 2, it helps us to better understand. So when we put blame on our kids, when we say they're acting out because they didn't get what they wanted, it almost comes with this applied assumption that they're spoiled or that they always get what they want. And when they don't get what they want, they cry or they tantrum or they throw themselves on the floor or they hit their brother or they break something or whatever their tantrum looks like. But I think that all too often we forget that toddlers don't have a frame of reference, right? they're new here. They've never done this life thing before. They've never experienced what life is like. And so they don't have a frame of reference to understand what's happening when they're denied access to something that they want. They just have now come to this place, this ability to have this awareness that they could ask for what they want. And sometimes they get it, which if you think about what's happening with a 2-year-old, just a few months before that, they didn't even know how to ask for what they wanted. They cried, and hopefully their caregivers figured out what they wanted, and then they got it. But when toddlers have this huge cognitive shift where they start to have this awareness that they can do things to make changes in their environment that can make them happy or sad, it becomes this huge shift in the way that they see their world. And so as parents, it looks to us, or caregivers, it looks to us like, well, they're just not getting what they want. But in all reality, they just figured out how to ask for what they want or to try to ask for what they want. And sometimes they don't get what they want, but they don't understand the why behind it. And so again, they're new here. They're just figuring this out. And they they're oftentimes their best next communication attempt after they've tried to ask for the thing they want, their next best attempt is to fall apart because, well, again, they're new at all of these skills and their emotional regulation is also new. And so that's the first thing that I want to just kind of open your awareness to that because I think oftentimes we forget that our kids, especially our toddlers, they're new here. They're new at this. They've not experienced these things before. I will often tell parents when, right, they tell their toddler, we don't throw blocks at the wall, or we don't throw blocks at your brother, or we don't throw blocks at the dog. But when that toddler came up with that idea, like, ooh, blocks, throw, right? And then they start throwing, and we tell them no, they don't necessarily, again, have a frame of reference to know what to shift that to. And so, because they had an idea, they were excited that they could put it into action. And then we tell them no, rightfully so, right? We don't want to encourage our kids to, hurt siblings or break things, but they don't know what else to do. And so, in that example, oftentimes one of the most effective strategies is to, instead of telling them, no, you can't do this, it's actually to tell them, hey, we don't throw blocks at the dog, but let's throw them in a bucket. And we show them what they can do to help, right? They had this idea, they were excited about it, they put it into action. And when we tell them no, they don't know where to go from that. So that's the second point that I wanted to make is that they shifting to a new idea can often be one of those causes of frustration. But when we can look at our kids through a different lens and start to see that they're not misbehaving, they just don't have many files to pull from at this point, it helps us shift the way that we approach them. Because I just see time and time again how easy it seems, right? Our child is misbehaving. They're kicking, they're throwing, they're screaming, they're doing whatever it is. And so many of us, myself included, were trained, whether through the way we were parented, what we saw on, TV, what we experienced in the school system. Maybe some of us learned professionally, watching our friends, as they were growing up. There's so many different ways that we were taught that when kids misbehave, it is the adult's job to correct that, to punish it, to address it, to make sure they know that that was wrong. And I'm not saying we don't teach our kids those things, but to really investigate first if what were doing really was wrong, if what they were doing really was making a decision to misbehave. Because the vast majority of times when toddlers, as we call it, misbehave, it's really just a really bad attempt at communication. They tried maybe a couple of different ways or a couple of different communication attempts and it didn't work for them. And so then their frustration is high and they've run out of ideas because they just have a limited repertoire to pull from. which is tricky to look at it that way when we have, highly verbal toddlers who are capable of explaining and sharing a lot of different things. Sometimes it can be really hard to look at our toddlers and realize they just don't have a ton of experience to pull from. So the other thing that I wanted to point out, right? Like these are clear communication snafus, right? The toddler had a plan and we disrupted it because what they were doing was unsafe or unkind. And we will oftentimes see behaviors because they just don't know what else to do. Another huge reason that we will see behaviors in toddlers is because, and this is kind of, maybe I should have said this one first, but this idea that up until around 18 months, sometimes 2 years, maybe a little bit sooner than that for some kids, but our infants and toddlers are one with their caregiver. They require their caregiver's assistance to fall asleep. They require their caregiver's assistance to know how to regulate themselves. That actually carries on for several more years. But they don't have this awareness that they're separate from their caregiver. And it is sometime between the ages of 1 and 2 that toddlers start to have this awareness that they're separate from their caregiver. They start to have this awareness that they can assert themselves and it has power, which is oftentimes why so many parents will say that one of their, after mama and dada and baba, that oftentimes toddlers' first word will be no, because it is so incredibly empowering when they can use that simple word to get a reaction out of the people in their life, to stop something that they don't want to happen, and they can have control over their environment. And this is a new skill for them, something they just realized. And so I often tell parents that, when there's, their toddler is saying no to them, that, it can feel frustrating, right? It can feel to the parents like we've lost control in our home. But what if this is a beautiful opportunity to really help to empower your kiddo to really hear hear or see the fruition of them saying no. When we can empower our kiddos to let them say no, and for us to give them the big reaction for that in a good way, like, whoa, yeah, you told me no, I heard you. I'm stopping whatever the thing is. It shows them that we hear them. It shows them that they matter. Which brings me to one of the next primary reasons that we tend to see a spike in behaviors around 2 years old. Because of this increased awareness that kiddos have, because of this increased ability to communicate, but to not really have a wealth of years of experiences to pull from, we'll see a spike in behaviors. And sometimes it's because of something that they want, right? They want ice cream and we tell them no, or they want to go outside, but it's, 95 degrees out, or they want to pull the cat's tail, but that's not safe, right? Sometimes it's because of something that they want and they've been denied access. But I would also encourage you to consider that when our kids are misbehaving, that it may in fact be due to an unmet need. As humans, there's some really core basic needs that we all have after, the basic needs have been met of food and shelter and warmth and clothing. There's some other really key needs that are, common to all humans. Things like feeling like we belong, feeling empowered, feeling like we're loved and that we're valued for who we are. And when we look at our toddlers through that lens, and say, for example, they've thrown themselves on the floor and they're tantruming, and it's so easy to look at the tantruming toddler and think they're misbehaving. But my hope for this episode is to, if you have a toddler in your life that you love, to really be able to take a pause and ask yourself, is there something that's happening in their life right now that is causing them to feel like they don't have power over their own life? Because they need it at this age. Around 2 years old, kids really need to feel empowered. And there's so many things that you can do in a home to help a toddler feel empowered. Things like letting them make decisions about what they're going to wear, what kind of utensils they want to use at dinner, what color cup they're going to use, um, whether you take a right or a left when you go on a walk, or even when you are driving your car and leaving your driveway. There are so many things that we can do to empower our toddlers that help them feel like they have control over their life. And I find that as an added bonus, if they can feel like they have a little bit of control over your life as well, like letting the toddler decide, give them two choices of the shirt that you're going to wear and let them pick one. Think about how empowering that is every time they see you wearing the shirt that they picked out for you that day. But it isn't just about power, right? Empowerment, feeling empowered is so incredibly important. And if you question me for a minute about whether or not toddlers need to feel empowered, just think about yourself and think about how you feel when somebody has taken away your power over something that you thought that you had a choice over. Because like I said, our toddlers, they don't have a ton of experience and examples to pull from. They don't have great problem solving to think of alternative solutions when things don't go the way that they want. And when they can feel empowered, it fills them up in the same way that it does for you. And when we take their power away from them, it does the same that it does for you. And so understanding that and really, you know, being able to put ourselves in our kids' shoes when we see them misbehaving. So power is one of them. Uh, Helping them feel like they belong, like they're included. I know that watching my granddaughters and the little one. So right now she's the baby sister, but when she feels like she isn't included, I can just see the devastation on her face. And then very quickly, we see her behaviors escalate because she feels like she doesn't belong. And so trying to find ways to include her that are safe for her when, you know, trying to navigate that to make sure she feels included has been a big goal in the way that I'm viewing things, is to figure out how to help her feel included as she's learning new skills. And it's so important for her to feel like she belongs. And then those last two about feeling loved and feeling valuable just because they exist. There's so many things that we can do as caregivers to help build this up for our kids, to help them see how valuable they are, not because they're, you know, cute or because they did something that made you happy or because they're, you know, so smart or so good at something, but valuable just because they exist. Not because of what they've done, not because of how well they behaved for you, but just because they are, because they're here. When we can help to build our kids up and see that our love or appreciation for them isn't contingent upon how well they're behaving or how good they're doing at a task from our point of view, it just has the power to help empower our kids, help to build them up, and most importantly, about the topic of this episode, it has the power to significantly reduce those toddler behaviors that for decades we have been labeling them as the terrible twos. And I would so lovingly argue that what we label as the toddler twos is us just not quite yet understanding what those unmet needs are underneath, and not quite yet really wrapping our heads around what our toddlers need from us, which I am well aware for many people is a different way of thinking about our kids. I think for decades or centuries, or I don't even know how long, we've been given this task that as parents, it is our job to shape and mold our kids into productive members of society, or shape and mold our kids into what we think is a good kid or a well-behaved kid. And I am here to challenge that because although I said, it would be great, or it is a highly likely outcome if we really meet these needs of our kids in a compassionate, unconditional, loving way. It has the power to significantly reduce behaviors. I trust that in my heart, but that isn't actually the goal. The goal isn't that they all be really well-behaved little compliant toddlers. That is not my goal at all. In fact, my goal for kids is that we have this gift to really empower them, not to shape and mold them into what we want them to be, but to be stewards for what they are meant to be. And so this is my challenge for you is can you consider looking at toddler behaviors differently? And I would love to hear about it. I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback about this because these kids really are the future. I know that's so cliche and people have been saying it for decades, but right now, today, it's 2026, and things are shifting for our kids. Things are shifting on our planet. We feel it, we see it in our kids, and our kids need us to wake the heck up and see them differently than our parents saw us. We can't keep parenting the way that we used to. Our kids need different from us. And so that's my challenge for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, about really shifting the way that we see our kids, shifting the way that we parent them, and really resetting the way that we think about toddler behaviors. Next episode, we're going to dig into teens. So stay tuned for that. So until next time, be well and love on those toddlers if you have them in your life.